Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at the Vimuttayatana Sutta. This is in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 5, discourse number 26. And this session follows on from our session on the Dhamma Vihari Suttas, which culminate in the importance of living by the Dhamma, Dhamma Vihari. So the reason why we're looking at this sutta today is because in our previous session we looked at different ways of practicing and learning the Dhamma, and it highlighted how if we don't understand the meaning and the truth of the Dhamma with wisdom, then it's very difficult to practice in accordance with the teachings and to penetrate and realize ultimately Nibbana. The sutta that we're looking at today looks at the different means by which one practices and learns the Dhamma, but goes a step further to say that each of those ways provide opportunities for understanding the meaning and the truth of the Dhamma, and to correct our view to say that by any one of those means one can actually realize Nibbana. And what we're going to go through is what those are, but specifically the words of the Buddha in how he says it, as well as to look at some examples as well through the suttas to show us how this can happen, or at least close to what we think can happen. And so it's a very important sutta because it may clear up some doubts that people have around the different ways that people practice and learn the Dhamma, and also to inspire us and encourage us in the different ways that we practice. The Buddha begins by saying to the monks, "Bhikkhus, there are these 5 opportunities for liberation, by means of which, if a bhikkhu dwells heedful, ardent, and resolute, his unliberated mind is liberated, his undestroyed taints are utterly destroyed, and he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage." What 5? So the Buddha is clearly saying that by these 5 different means or opportunities for liberation, if applying oneself with vigilance, with energy, and with determination or resolution, one can realize Nibbana. So what are these 5 opportunities or bases for liberation? The first is when a teacher teaches us the Dhamma. The second is when we teach the Dhamma to others in detail. The third is when we recite the Dhamma in detail. The fourth is when we ponder, examine, and mentally inspect the Dhamma. And the final one is when we have grasped, attended, sustained, and penetrated well with wisdom a certain basis for concentration. So we're going to look at each of these in more detail. For each opportunity for liberation, the Buddha explains the same insight pathway to be followed. And so as you're practicing one of those bases or opportunities for liberation, what happens is one experiences inspiration in the meaning and the Dhamma. Then gladness arises. When gladdened, rapture or joy arises. And then one with a joyful or rapturous mind, their body becomes tranquil. One tranquil in body then feels pleasure or happiness. And for one feeling that pleasure or happiness, the mind becomes concentrated. And finally, if one dwells heedful, ardent, and resolute, one's unliberated mind is liberated, one's undestroyed taints are utterly destroyed, and one reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage. So that's the standard insight pathway for each opportunity. So you can see with the first part, it's the same as what we studied in the Dhamma Vihari Suttas, that it's very important to experience inspiration from the meaning and the truth of the Dhamma. One penetrates the truth with wisdom. And the next 5 parts are associated with entering into the form jhanas. This is the standard sequence that the Buddha gives as you move from first jhana, second jhana, third, and then into the 4th. What is important is that hindrances have been removed. When you enter into the first jhana, you're no longer troubled by sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and of course the doubt. And so when that happens, you penetrate into a higher concentration that as you move through the jhanas, you relinquish the bodily formations, verbal formations, and mental formations. And so the final part is when you are dwelling heedful. So this is with vigilance, and one is ardent, so you're exerting energy towards the task. And you're resolute, you have a very strong determination for Nibbana. And so this is through these different opportunities or bases, one can attain to supreme liberation. And so it's very inspiring and something that encourages us if we take it in the correct way. When we look at the 5 opportunities for liberation, whether it is listening to a teacher teach the Dhamma in detail, or whether it is ourselves teaching the Dhamma, or whether we are reciting the Dhamma in detail, whether we are mentally inspecting and contemplating the Dhamma ourselves, or whether we have obtained an object of concentration and penetrated the truth. In all 5 cases, what is clear is to penetrate the meaning and the truth of the Dhamma, one needs wisdom. And so in many sessions we talk about sharpening our spiritual faculties, of which wisdom is one of those spiritual faculties. The foundation for the spiritual faculty of wisdom needs to be understood. And it helps us to understand through this wisdom why we get these opportunities for liberation. So when we talk about the foundation for the spiritual faculty of wisdom, there is wisdom produced by hearing or learning. This is called sutamayī. Then we have wisdom produced by thought, which is called cintāmayī. And then finally we have wisdom produced by development, bhāvanāmayī. To understand how that works in terms of the foundation for the spiritual faculty of wisdom, let's delve a little bit deeper, and we're going to draw on some of what we've looked at before when we've looked at the sacred quality of conviction or saddha, and also draw on our session from yoniso manasikara, the importance of wise contemplation. And we'll see something really arise when it comes to right view. So there is a connection in our practice between right view, wisdom, and conviction, something that really helps us to progress on the path. So when it comes to sutamayī, which is wisdom produced by hearing or learning, this wisdom comes from another's utterance, which is the parato goso in Pali. Now we've been through this before, you'll recall this when we've looked at yoniso manasikara. So cintāmayī, this wisdom is coming from wise contemplation of one's own arising. So in Pali this is called paccata samuttitta yoniso manasikara. So this is wisely contemplating how do we create this particular birth, this particular existence, how do we come to arise? That's part of cintāmayī. And then the bhāvanāmayī, this kind of wisdom comes from another's utterance, wise contemplation, and insight knowledge of one's own arising. Again, what you see is you need the words of another, you need wise contemplation of how did I come to arise, and then what happens with bhāvanāmayī, the insight knowledge arises around that. There's a natural progression. Now you would think, okay, is it one or the other, or is it a few when it comes to this wisdom? It's actually all of them. They all activate when we practice, whether it's listening to Dhamma, reciting the Dhamma, teaching others, or mentally inspecting the Dhamma ourselves, or taking a meditation object. These different foundations of wisdom arise. Now what's really interesting is when you look at the first two, sutamayī and cintāmayī, if you combine the two, what you get is words of another and wise contemplation. Right view arises due to these two things. It's in the Mahavedala Sutta when the question is asked, what are the conditions for the arising of right view? And the answer that is given is words that come from another, and it's the Buddha's teaching itself, whether it's you read or listen to the Buddha, or someone else teaches you that. And of course, wise contemplation, yoniso manasikara, and then many different ways of wisely contemplating. But in the case of cintāmayī paññā, the ultimate thing that one really wants to understand is, how did I cause this birth to arise? How did I come into being? Why did I arise? And of course, this comes back to the Four Noble Truths. We know that arising comes from tanha, craving, and therefore we have this whole mass of suffering. So when you hear the words of the Buddha and you contemplate in this way, wisdom arises. You can see how it's the grounds for that. And when insight knowledge arises around these things, then conviction increases or it develops. If one were to ask who has the most wisdom, the most conviction, and the most right view, of course it would begin with the Buddha, and then the Noble Arahants who have completed the path, fully developed the Noble Eightfold Path. But then, for people that haven't completed and realized Nibbana, you would say the person with the most conviction is the one with the most right view and the most wisdom. The person who is the most wise in the world at the moment is the one with the most conviction and the most right view. So it works like that. There is an interworking. And you see that it is all grounded in the teachings of the Buddha, or through hearing from another the teachings of the Buddha, and then wisely contemplating and developing insight knowledge. So this is very important as an input in terms of these 5 opportunities for liberation. Let's now deep dive into the 5 opportunities for liberation. And the first is when a teacher teaches us the Dhamma. So the Buddha says in the Sutta, "Here bhikkhus, the teacher, or a fellow monk in the position of a teacher, teaches the Dhamma to a bhikkhu. In whatever way the teacher or that fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the Dhamma to the bhikkhu, in just that way he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the Dhamma. As he does so, gladness arises in him. When he is glad, rapture arises. For one with a rapturous mind, the body becomes tranquil. One tranquil in body feels pleasure. For one feeling pleasure, the mind becomes concentrated. This is the first basis for liberation, by means of which if a bhikkhu dwells heedful, ardent, and resolute, his unliberated mind is liberated, his undestroyed taints are utterly destroyed, and he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage." So we can see that hearing the Dhamma from a teacher, listening in that way, this is sutamayī paññā can arise. And when that is the case, the meaning and the truth of the Dhamma becomes clear. When that happens, one can penetrate and attain to the jhanas. And if one keeps using that first basis or opportunity, one can realize ultimate liberation. The question that normally arises these days is this still possible? At the time of the Buddha, there were numerous cases that we read in the suttas where people attained arahantship, where the Buddha gave a teaching. And also at other times when noble arahants also did the same thing. And so the question often arises, is it possible for this to happen now? And probably the answer in terms of arahantship is not clear. We don't know. But what is most interesting about this one is at the time of the Buddha it was very clear, because of the Buddha being around and because of the noble attainments of his chief disciples and foremost noble disciples, then it was very much possible. And I think one of the things that is most important is to be able to look at some examples. So we're not going to go through a whole lot because there are so many examples, particularly when you read the commentary around the sayings in the Dhammapada, and also when you read particular passages of the suttas as well. We can now look at this story of Bahiyadārucīriya, which is from Dhammapada verse number 101, to help us to find some support for this first opportunity for liberation. So the commentary to this particular saying of the Buddha tells us that there was a group of merchants who went out to sea in a boat. And their boat was wrecked at sea, and there was only one survivor. This sole survivor got hold of a plank and eventually managed to come to land at the port of Suparaka. Because he was naked, he tied a piece of bark to his body, and he also got a hold of a bowl, and he sat in place so people could see where he was. Passers-by gave him rice and gruel, and even some thought that he was a holy man and paid respects to him. Some brought clothes, but he feared that if he wore the clothes, people would give him less respect. And because some of the people thought he was an arahant, he mistakenly came to think that he really was. So he became someone with micca-ditthi, with wrong view. And he became known as Bahiyadārucīriya because of wearing this piece of bark as his clothing. Now Mahabrahma came to him one night and said to him, "Bahya, you are not an arahant yet, and what is more, you do not have the qualities that make you an arahant." And Bahya looked up at Mahabrahma and said, "Yes, I must admit that I am not an arahant as you have said. I now realize that I've done a great wrong. But is there anyone else in this world who is an arahant?" And so Mahabrahma told him that there lived in Savatthi this teacher called Gautama Buddha, an arahant who was perfectly enlightened all on his own. So Bahya found the Buddha going on alms round with other monks and respectfully followed him. He pleaded with the Buddha to teach him the Dhamma, but the Buddha replied that since they were on alms round, it was not yet time for teaching Dhamma. And again Bahya pleaded, "Venerable, one cannot know the danger to your life or to my life, so please teach me the Dhamma." The Buddha knew that Bahya had made the journey of 120 yojanas in one night, so a very long journey. And he also saw that Bahya was overwhelmed with joy at seeing the Buddha. And that was why the Buddha did not want to talk the Dhamma immediately to Bahya, because he wanted him to calm down to enable him to penetrate the Dhamma properly. But still Bahya persisted in pleading with the Buddha, "Bahya, when you see an object, be conscious of just the visible object. When you hear a sound, be conscious of just the sound. When you smell or taste or touch something, be conscious of just the smell, the taste, or the touch. And when you think of anything, just be conscious of the mental object." After hearing the teaching from the Buddha, Bahya attained arahantship, and he asked permission from the Buddha to join the Sangha. The Buddha told him to get the robes, the bowl, and the other requisites of a monk. On his way to get them, he was gored to death by a cow. When the Buddha and the other monks came out after having had their meal, they found Bahya lying in a rubbish heap. As instructed by the Buddha, the monks cremated the body of Bahya and had his bones enshrined in a stupa. Back at Jetavana monastery, the Buddha told the monks that Bahya had realized Nibbana. He also told them that as far as speed was concerned in attaining the special knowledges, the abhiññā, Bahya was the fastest, the foremost. And the monks were puzzled by the statement made by the Buddha, so they asked him why and when Bahya had become an arahant. And the Buddha replied, "Bahya attained arahantship while he listened to my instructions given to him on the road when we were on alms round." And the monks wondered, how could one attain arahantship after listening to just a few sentences of the Buddha? So the Buddha told them that a number of words or the length of speech did not matter if it was beneficial to someone. And so he uttered the verse, "Though there are 1,000 verses consisting of meaningless words, better is one word or one line of a verse. Whenever heard, one grows calm." And so we see here that it is possible at the time of the Buddha for one to realize Nibbana, realize the fruit of arahantship from hearing the words of the Buddha. Now when we think about the enormity of this is very, very powerful, very, very substantial. And what is clear is that the words that are uttered are the words of the Buddha. And that is why we study the Sutta so closely. That is why we read out word for word the words of the Buddha, because they are powerful words. They have a lot of meaning and truth in them. And it is up to us to ensure that we penetrate and realize that truth. The second opportunity for liberation comes when one teaches the Dhamma to others in detail. And here the Buddha says, again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the Dhamma to a bhikkhu, but he himself teaches the Dhamma to others in detail, as he has heard it and learned it. In whatever way the bhikkhu teaches the Dhamma to others in detail, as he has heard it and learned it, in just that way, in relation to that Dhamma, he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the Dhamma. And as he does so, gladness arises in him, and then it goes all the way through to he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage. So what is very evident here that is helpful to us is coming back to sutamayī paññā and cintāmayī paññā. So as we know, wisdom that is produced by hearing and wisdom that is produced by thought are two things that are underpinned by the words of another and wise contemplation. When you teach the Dhamma to activate right view, which those two are the grounds for right view to arise, you would naturally also expect that right view arises in oneself as you are teaching the Dhamma, sharing the Dhamma with others in detail, and you are taking them through particular insight pathways. Now, when you understand and have penetrated a certain amount of those insight pathways in your meditation, and you're able to convey that to other people, what may happen while one is teaching is for that insight pathway to become clearer, because something that you have previously contemplated, previously practiced, previously realized to a certain extent, and are able to share with others, at the time of sharing that Dhamma, one may be able to enter into jhana. It's quite a remarkable thing because it's very hard to imagine. But if you have taught the Dhamma, then you understand that there is particular truth to this. One can go into particularly right concentration. When right view is there, it is leading, and the noble right intention, and you have all the virtue supporting that. Everything that is activated in the Noble Eightfold Path is there, and one teaches from that place. If one is actually conveying the truth, conveying the meaning as you understand it, at some point while you are teaching, it is possible to penetrate further. And so that is something quite remarkable. For each of these opportunities for liberation, it's good to be able to find an example from the suttas to, in this case, find someone who fully awakened while teaching the Dhamma. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to find someone in this particular instance. The closest I could find from reading the Thera Apadana and the Thera Apadana was Bhikkhuni Sukka. And even then, I'm not sure that she didn't actually awaken outside of teaching the Dhamma. So she was someone that was born multiple times as a nun at the time of Vipassī Buddha, and then after that she was reborn into the Deva realm, and then after that she was reborn again as a nun in the time of Sikhi Buddha, Vesabhu Buddha, Kakusanda Buddha, Kunagamana Buddha, and also Kassapa Buddha. And in the last life, she was born into a householder family in Rajagaha, and was very impressed with the Buddha's teachings when he visited Rajagaha, and so she became a lay follower. And after hearing a teaching from Bhikkhuni Dhammadina, she entered the order of the Sangha. She was very well known as a great teacher and the head of 500 nuns. There's a couple of suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya where a yakka is praising her ability to teach. If we go to the Thera Apadana, some of her words allude to the fact that while teaching, it's possible for people to enter into the stream or develop some understanding of the Dhamma. So the words in the Sukka Thera Apadana, and this is number 35, it says, "Seeing the Buddha's majesty and hearing him, heap of virtues, pleasing my heart in the Buddha, I venerated him with all my strength. At some moment after that, in the presence of Dhammadina, having gone forth from my own home, I went forth into homelessness. I destroyed all the defilements while my hair was being cut off. Going forth, in no long time, I learned the Buddha's entire dispensation. After that, I taught the Dhamma in a huge gathering of people. While Dhamma was being taught, there was understanding of the truth. Seeing varied thousands of people achieving insight, astonished, a spirit, very pleased by me, roaming about Rajgir, said this: Why are these people in Rajgir acting like nymphs drunk on honey, unless they're honoring Sukka, who's teaching the ambrosial state? Methinks the wise are drinking that irresistible and unmixed strength bestower, like travellers drink rainwater from a rain cloud. So although this may not show Bhikkhuni Sukka fully enlightening while teaching the Dhamma, it's still quite an inspiring episode to include. And the third opportunity for liberation comes when one recites the Dhamma in detail. The Buddha says, again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the Dhamma to a bhikkhu, nor does he himself teach the Dhamma to others in detail, as he has heard it and learned it. But he recites the Dhamma in detail, as he has heard it and learned it. In whatever way the bhikkhu recites the Dhamma in detail, as he has heard it and learned it, in just that way, in relation to that Dhamma, he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the Dhamma. As he does so, gladness arises in him, and then it follows the insight pathway all the way to the mind becoming concentrated. And this is the third basis of liberation. So what is good to understand here is again the importance of, while reciting the Dhamma in detail, being able to penetrate the meaning of that Dhamma and to understand the truth contained in that Dhamma. What it reminds us is not to simply recite the Dhamma without considering the words we are reciting. And in many ways, it is a reminder and encouragement to really look at the insight pathways that are contained in the suttas that we recite, to really look for the skilled states that are being purified as one goes through a sutta. So there is something very important and pronounced that the Buddha is pointing to here. One of the examples that we have for reciting the Dhamma and being able to enter into the stream is the story of Anathapindika's son Kala. And we had a separate session on this particular Dhammapada verse. What is interesting is it's not an example of someone who fully liberates while reciting. However, it does give us some insight into how entering into the stream can happen, how one attains to noble attainments. So if you remember with Kala, he was reluctant to be around the Buddha and the monks. And Anathapindika was concerned and afraid for his son and this particular behavior. In many ways, what he did was he bribed his son, promised him some money if he would go to the monastery and be around the good company. However, he didn't really go and spend time with the Buddha, and so Anathapindika tried again. And so this time he said, if you go and learn a gatha, a verse from the Buddha, then he'll double the money or offer more money to him. And so Kala went to the monastery and went to the Buddha and requested to learn something. And the Buddha gave him a short verse to learn. And at the same time, he used his supernormal powers to make it difficult for Kala to memorize it. So Kala ended up spending the whole night at the monastery repeating this single verse many, many times. And because he had to repeat it so many times, and in the end he came to perceive the full meaning of that particular verse, that particular Dhamma. And so he realized the fruit of stream entry. And the story goes on that they went back to his house and Anathapindika offered dana and so on. So you can refer to that particular video for more. At the end of it, the Buddha recites the verse saying, sole sovereignty over the earth, or going to a heavenly place, or domination over the entire world, the fruit of stream entry is superior. And so this is again a reminder saying it doesn't matter what we do in this particular lifetime, even if we were to become the king or the queen, or even after this particular lifetime what we practice, we go to a heavenly realm. It's still not as valuable, as precious as the attainment to the fruit of stream entry. This is a very strong reminder. We can also look at an example in practice. Say, for example, if we are to recite the Karaniya Metta Sutta that we have studied. We know that this particular sutta has an insight pathway. We have gone through this before, whether we call it Metta School or simply developing the ability to cultivate loving kindness, metta. Where this particular teaching ends up and the insight pathway, if we follow these instructions from the Buddha, we end up with this very strong determination not to come again into a mother's womb. If one fully penetrates this particular teaching, then one realizes the fruit of non-return, anagami. when you look at this and you're reciting, the encouragement from the Vimuttayatana Sutta is to penetrate and be inspired by the meaning and the truth in this sutta. So there are 10 skilled states that are being promoted as one goes through this sutta. So that means one is abandoning the unwholesome states, the dasa akusala, and cultivating and developing or ensuring that we have the skilled states. So this is bodily skilled states, verbal skilled states, and mental skilled states. So you can imagine as you're reciting, you're making sure, am I upright? Am I thoroughly upright? Am I easy to instruct? One is discerning what this really means. For easy to instruct, in a simple manner, is there envy? Is there disparaging? Is there derogation? Is there stinginess? And if there is, then one abandons. And while one is reciting, you go on, am I gentle, not arrogant? Am I contented and easy to support? Am I controlled in the sense faculties? And so on and so forth. There's something very powerful in the Buddha's words. So some people absolutely love reciting the Dhamma. So if you have that preference, then it's important to ensure you have this dimension, that it is an opportunity for liberation. And other people don't like reciting the Dhamma. It's important to remember that the Buddha says for the continuation of the Dhamma, it's important to memorize and recite the Dhamma. And of course this very much applies to the monks and the nuns, but for lay people as well, it's also an encouragement that this is another opportunity for liberation. And it's also for lay people as well to contribute to the non-decline and continuation of the Buddha's teachings. The fourth opportunity for liberation is when one ponders, examines, and mentally inspects the Dhamma. The Buddha says, again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the Dhamma to a bhikkhu, nor does he teach the Dhamma to others in detail, as he has heard it and learned it, nor does he recite the Dhamma in detail, as he has heard it and learned it. But he ponders, examines, and mentally inspects the Dhamma, as he has heard it and learned it. In whatever way the bhikkhu ponders, examines, and mentally inspects the Dhamma as he has heard it and learned it, in just that way, in relation to that Dhamma, he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the Dhamma. As he does so, gladness arises in him, and then it follows the same insight pathway, and the mind becomes concentrated. This is the fourth basis of liberation. So when you look at this is very much associated with, most importantly, cintāmayī paññā, because when we wisely contemplate the Dhamma, and particularly to inspect it from our own experience, from what is arising in our situation, then there's something very powerful in that. That's how one can get inspired to find the meaning of the Dhamma. When we have these sessions, we always bring examples from real life. And of course, the encouragement is to bring your own direct examples. That is the way that you directly connect with the Dhamma, and then the way for the meaning and the truth to arise. So wisdom arises through thought, through contemplation, through reflection on the Dhamma itself. What we can see, just like the other parts that we've been through so far, whether it is hearing Dhamma from a teacher, or whether it is teaching the Dhamma ourselves, or recitation of the Dhamma, when we learn and practice in this way, we are fulfilling the Buddha's learning system. You can see how it all connects together in this way. And even when we discuss the Dhamma, it is also in this way, Dhamma sākaca. We ponder, examine, and mentally inspect, even while talking about it. So the misconception that comes up when it comes to bhavana, development of the mind, or meditation, is that we're meant to just simply still the thoughts. But the stilling of thoughts that the Buddha talks about comes through investigating the Dhamma, comes through this particular point about pondering, examining, and mentally inspecting the Dhamma. It's when we don't do that is when we sustain the wrong view. And if we sustain the wrong view, then the path that unfolds is the wrong path. The reason why the Buddha encourages pondering, examining, mentally inspecting the Dhamma, contemplating in this way. It promotes the right view, as we've seen, from sutamayī paññā and cintāmayī paññā. And then when we bhavana, then it becomes bhāvanāmayī paññā, and it all comes together. So with all these particular steps, it's important that right view is there. This is something very critical to the Buddha's teaching, and something that the Buddha says the Noble Eightfold Path leads with. It always leads with right view. And if you look back on the examples that we've been through before, the Buddha always says the Dhamma in detail as one has heard it and learned it. So he's always promoting that it begins with sutamayī paññā, and then you go on from there. So you combine it with the cintāmayī paññā, and one gets to the right view. So this is fundamental to the Buddha's teaching, whether you have twigged on to that or not. It is there in the Buddha's words. So right view is being triggered each and every time. Whatever Dhamma in detail one has heard and learned, and then when you inspect in a particular way, thinking about the insight pathways, thinking about the words of the Buddha, examining them, what do they mean? What is an example that I can bring to it that helps me to connect with this Dhamma? That's where the wisdom arises. And when you deeply develop the mind on that, insight, knowledge, or wisdom arises in that way. The example that we can draw on is Bhikkhuni Sona and her story. She was the foremost nun, if you remember, for having the capacity for arousing energy or effort. So in Pali this is arada viryonam. The reason why she's a good example is because her full liberation came while reflecting on the Dhamma as she boiled water for the nuns. If we go to the Sona Thera, this is number 26, we can read out her words. And now in my final rebirth, I'm born in a millionaire's clan, rich, prosperous, very wealthy, in Savatthi, best of cities. When I'd become a young woman, having gone to a husband's clan, I was the mother of 10 sons, very handsome and distinguished. All of them were comfortable, delightful in the people's eyes, brilliant even to enemies. Needless to say, they're loved by me. Then, without my desiring it, he who was my husband went forth to the Buddha's dispensation, surrounded by those sons of mine. And then, alone, I reflected, enough with this life here for me. Growing old and in misery, bereft of my husband and sons, I will also go to the place where my husband has now arrived. After reflecting in that way, I went forth into homelessness, and then the nuns left me alone in the retreat for Buddhist nuns, going off with the instruction, heat up the water while we're gone. Then bringing water, I poured it into a small pot used for that. After placing it on the hearth, seated, from there concentrated the mind, seeing the 5 aggregates as impermanent, suffering and not self, having thrown off all the taints, attained arahantship. So this gives us an example of one who has pondered, examined and mentally inspected the Dhamma. And in the case of Bhikkhuni Sona, it was while doing something very mundane. The background to Bhikkhuni Sona was that she was an elderly nun and would bother the nuns a little bit with her tendencies. But she made a lot of effort around overcoming that and to arouse energy, particularly in the night. She would do walking meditation in the dark. So she's a very wonderful inspiration in terms of being able to realize full liberation while contemplating and reflecting the Dhamma, even doing something quite mundane. As a good example for us to use, there's a very simple meditation that we've looked at in terms of yoniso manasikara, and it's something that the Buddha often would question the monks about, and the answer is a contemplation in and of itself. So there's a guided meditation that we have that is called, Is it worth taking as me and mine? And it's a very simple but powerful reflection. When you contemplate this, you say, if it is impermanent, so anicca, suffering, dukkha, and subject to change, vipranama, is it worth taking as me and mine? So we could be commuting, as an example, sitting on a bus or a train, and you just simply do this pondering of this Dhamma. Examine it in your mind. So you think about this body. If this body is impermanent, this particular birth is impermanent because we're subject to aging, sickness and death. So isn't it suffering? So tick in 2 boxes. It's impermanent, it's suffering. And then you see the subject to change because this body ages. And you ask yourself, is it worth taking as me and mine? Even while we are doing things in the house, such as what Bhikkhuni Sauna was doing, boiling a pot of water, this is the type of reflection that one can do. In many ways, the inspiration, of course, comes that if you can understand the meaning while you are doing this reflection, then the opportunity for liberation comes. And if it's not full liberation, then it's realizing noble attainment. So the fruit of stream entry, the fruit of once return, the fruit of non-return. The 5th and final opportunity for liberation, the Buddha says in this Vimuttayatana Sutta, is when one has penetrated well with wisdom a certain basis for concentration. And I think this is the one that most of us understand quite well and expect in terms of development of the mind and development of practice. So the Buddha says, again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the Dhamma to a bhikkhu, nor does he teach the Dhamma to others in detail as he has heard it and learned it, nor does he recite the Dhamma in detail as he has heard it and learned it, nor does he ponder, examine and mentally inspect the Dhamma as he has heard it and learned it. But he has grasped well a certain object of concentration, attended to it well, sustained it well, and penetrated it well with wisdom. In whatever way the bhikkhu has grasped well a certain basis for concentration, attended to it well, sustained it well, and penetrated it well with wisdom, in just that way, in relation to that Dhamma, he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the Dhamma. As he does so, gladness arises in him, and it follows the same insight pathway through the jhanas, and the mind becomes concentrated. This is the 5th basis of liberation. So the Pali here is Thera samadhi nimittam. So this is what has been translated as a certain basis for concentration. Sometimes it's also translated as object of concentration. But if you look at that particular Pali term, Thera samadhi nimittam, you can refer to the Chula Vedala Sutta and the question about what is this basis for concentration. And the answer that Dhammadina Bhikkhuni gives to Visakha is the basis for concentration are the 4 establishments of mindfulness. Many of the insight pathway meditations establish this because it always begins with the body, that one truly understands the body for what it is, and that it is subject to aging, sickness and death, that it is comprised of the 4 elements, the 32 body parts, that it is subject to decay, that it is not this beautiful thing, that its true nature is repulsive because of what happens to it. And when you establish that it is impermanent and therefore not worth taking as me and mine, then you fully establish the foundations of mindfulness, that this body is not something that really will bring sukha feelings, that at the end of the day what results is always the dukkha feelings. This is established when you take the Buddha's teachings and instruction, particularly the instruction of the Buddha and the insight pathway meditations. You really get to penetrate well with wisdom, and the opportunity for liberation comes to be. So when the encouragement comes to pay attention to the instructions from the Buddha and to follow the insight pathway that is given in these suttas, this is because that's how wisdom arises. So when you look at, again, sutamayī paññā, cintāmayī paññā, and bhāvanāmayī paññā, what you see is that the Buddha is always encouraging to establish on right view. And so this has been repeated throughout this session because it's actually very important. When you begin with right view, then all the path factors are being developed in the correct way, and therefore you have the right path and the right practice. If you have been practicing the meditations that have been encouraged, then it's so easy to understand this particular opportunity for liberation, because gladness certainly does arise when you penetrate the truth. And you experience the mental absorptions, the jhanas, with no trouble or difficulty because you have contemplated the Buddha's words sequentially, understood the insight pathway. It's not that you had to try to attain jhanas. In reality, the jhanas happen because you have contemplated them correctly, the words of the Buddha. You have been easy to instruct by sticking to the insight pathway. And so when that happens, those that have followed the instructions of the Buddha, you know that the mind concentrates easily. Now, what you read in the suttas is many examples of those that have taken a certain basis for concentration from the Buddha and gone to the forest, and then they've realized arahantship. So this applies the same for us. The aspiration to be fully liberated is a very kusala one, a very noble one, a very wholesome, skillful intention. And that's what is supported by the Buddha's teachings. And so that's why we encourage each other to walk this path diligently, ardently, and with a lot of energy and determination. There are many stories that we can draw upon because the Buddha gave a basis for concentration to many of the Sangha, and they went off to the forest and then attained arahantship. The one that we're going to look at today is the story of Dhammika Thera, and this is from Dhammapada verse number 84, and this is about living correctly. Dhammika Thera, at the time, from the Dhammapada commentary, it tells us that he was a layman living in Savatthi with his wife. And one day he told his pregnant wife that he wished to become a monk, and his wife pleaded with him to wait until after the birth of their child. So he waited, and when the child was born, he again requested his wife to let him go. And again she pleaded with him to wait until the child could walk. And then Dhammika thought to himself, it will be useless for me to ask my wife for her approval to join the Sangha. So he made a very firm decision, and he left the house and became a monk. And he took a basis for concentration from the Buddha, and he practiced meditation ardently and diligently, and he soon became an arahant. Some years later, he visited his old house in order to teach the Dhamma to his son and to his wife. And his son entered the Sangha, and he too attained arahantship. And then his wife thought, now that both my husband and my son have left the house, I had better leave it too. And then with this thought, she left the household life and became a nun. And she too eventually became an arahant. And at the congregation of monks, the Buddha told how Dhammika Thera had become a monk and attained arahantship, and through him then his son and his wife also attained arahantship. And then the Buddha said, Bhikkhus, a wise man does not wish for wealth or prosperity by doing evil things. Whether it is for his own sake or for the sake of others, he works for his own liberation from the rounds of rebirth by comprehending the teachings and living according to the Dhamma. And so he uttered the verse, not for one's own sake, nor another's, not wishing for sons, wealth, or a kingdom, not longing for success by unrighteous means. This is one who is virtuous, wise, and righteous. And so this particular story resonates on a deeper level when you think about Prince Siddhartha and what he also did in order to become the Buddha. What is apparent is actually this question of who does our spiritual practice benefit? And in both cases with Prince Siddhartha and also this Dhammika Thera, their spiritual practice inevitably, ultimately benefited themselves but also benefited others. And in the case of the Buddha, the renunciation that he did in giving up over multiple lifetimes and then in his final lifetime was immense. And I think when you contemplate that, it deepens one's understanding, because for the average person, the putujana, the worldling, it's very difficult to understand how one can abandon one's family in order to walk the spiritual path. It's when you don't have sufficient wisdom that you don't see this question of who does your spiritual practice benefit? And so this also becomes inspiration for us, because what is greater than serving one's family in one lifetime is being able to limit their suffering over many lifetimes, not just this one. The Buddha ends the teaching on the Vimuttayatana Sutta by saying, "These bhikkhus are the 5 opportunities for liberation, by means of which, if a bhikkhu dwells heedful, ardent, and resolute, his unliberated mind is liberated, his undestroyed taints are utterly destroyed, and he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage." So the key to this final statement, and it is the same as the start of the teaching from the Buddha, is that we are heedful, vigilant towards the truth, the right view, vigilant towards what is kusala, what is akusala, so what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. We are ardent, so that means we have energy towards the task, we make effort, and we're resolute, so there's a very strong determination to make progress on this path. So take this as an encouragement towards how one practices, and also to correct any misconceptions about what the Buddha has or hasn't encouraged, and to use this as ingredients towards how we come to practice, how we come to fulfill the Noble Eightfold Path. We have looked at many different examples through looking at this Vimuttayatana Sutta. It's good to take this as inspiration for our practice and to also draw on others from the suttas as well. So we can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem, wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.